Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Your Spiritual Journey. This is Dr. Bob Dove, and today we've got a pretty exciting guest. I can tell you, I just finished her book last night, and it's just amazing. So without further ado, this is Debra Holz. Debra is an accomplished writer and certified life coach. She's got a bachelor's degree from the United States International University. She attended graduate school at Boston University. Her book, Out of the Darkness, Aligning Science and Spirit to Overcome Depression, achieved #1 best-selling new release in 6 categories on Amazon and won first prize from the Author Zone for nonfiction spiritual book in 2022. And I can tell you that book is just so fascinating. I couldn't put it down. I only had a few days to read it, and I got through it because you've just had such a fascinating life. So I'm going to turn the mic over to Debra, as we usually do on this podcast. She will give us her background from childhood to current day, hitting her spiritual journey highlights, and then I'll ask a couple questions.
Okay.
It's all yours, Deb.
Okay. Thanks, Bob. Okay, well, we're going to begin from my childhood. My book begins with my experience in a psychiatric hospital hooked up to IVs because of issues I had with my depression, and that was a culmination of what began as a child. So when I was 4, my mother told my brother and me that we were going to Disneyland. And my mother was young. She was 17 when she had me. And she instead took us to a foster home and dropped us off. And the reason I bring that up is because I believe that was when I was first aware that I was depressed. I didn't have the word for it, of course, but I was so traumatized by what happened, and I was left there. My brother and I were left there for a couple of years, and I believe, retrospectively, of course, the lack of connection to anybody. The foster mother was not nice, and we weren't treated with any kind of affection or love or even niceness during those 2 years. And I believe that began my lack of connectedness to anybody. We're social beings, and we need to connect with other people. The reason I say that, because it's important to what happened to me in terms of the depression. I now see the depression more or less as a spiritual malady that my brain began wiring itself for depression at that point, if not already. When I was 6, my parents showed up and decided to take us back from the foster home. And the reason that they gave us, they took us to a park and sat us down at a bench, and they told us that they had found God. And they found Jesus, and Jesus told them that we should be a family. So they were previously married, got divorced, and remarried so we could be a family. Thus began my indoctrination into fundamentalist Christianity, where I was told, and now I would say I was brainwashed, but I was told that if I didn't believe that Jesus was the only way to God, and anyone who doesn't believe Jesus is the only way to God, they're going to hell for sure. And at that church, it was Torrance Baptist Church in Los Angeles County, I they talked about they were always sending missionaries to save the savages in the deepest, darkest jungles of Africa. And I would question about what if the missionaries don't find some of the savages, not really knowing at that point in my life that that was really a racist word. And they would say, well, if we don't reach the savages, there'll be a special condition. And I'd say, well, if Jesus is the only way to God and you never reach them and they don't hear about Jesus, are they going to hell? And the most of the adults that I would propose this idea to would say, well, Jesus will show himself to them somehow. I'm like, how? In the clouds? In a dream? How will they know about Jesus? And usually when I was 6 years old when I didn't buy this stuff, um, they would get frustrated and tell me that I asked too many questions. But despite my doubts about that being possible, because I thought it was preposterous, um, I believed I was going to go to hell if I didn't believe this, and I tried to believe it. Um, and ultimately, my parents divorced again when I was 11, and my brother and I were pretty much left on our own to fend for ourselves. My mom was very troubled, and she really wasn't able to care for us. And I never had or made connections with other people my whole life, really. Matter of fact, I really didn't have friends until about 8 years ago when I sort of healed myself and had my spiritual awakening. Um, but let me go back to where I was. So I spent 50 years depressed. I believe that underlying my depression was a terrible fear of death and the inability to connect with others. As I got older, especially as I watched how my mother was in relationships with men, I desperately needed to connect with someone. And so as a teenager, I started making bad choices about boys and men in my search to find a way to connect with somebody. Um, and there, so now I sort of laugh about it because it's so ridiculous. You know, at the time, I was searching for someone to feel the chasm in my soul. Um, Somebody to help make the pain go away and to feel part of something. So, in every relationship, except this last one, which I will tell you about later, um, I was trying to make a man, and plus I was missing a loving father in my life. I was trying to make a man fill that gap, and it never worked. Um, it turns out I was looking in the wrong place for that. It never worked, and I ended up more depressed than ever. Um, Fast forward to 2007, after what was about to be my third failed marriage, um, I was suicidal. My whole life, even as a child, I thought about suicide. I saw it as a possible way out, a relief if I could. Um, if I couldn't resolve my pain um, and my aloneness. That was an option. And I always held it out there as an option, but I kept trying to find a way to soothe the pain. So in 2007, things were bad. I was suicidal. I was so depressed that I spent weeks in bed. You know, it's disgusting to think now, but I didn't brush my teeth, take a shower, wash my hair, because people who haven't really been severely depressed don't always understand that it becomes very physical. I couldn't even get my hands up to wash my hair, so I'd stay in bed for weeks and um, at the very minimal days. And it got to the point where, because I hadn't been the best mother, mainly because of my depression and attempting to self-medicate with alcohol, I hadn't been the best mother. So by 2007, the guilt I felt, the remorse I felt, the hopelessness that things are never going to get better. And I don't deserve to take space up on earth. So 2007, I began what I call um, wine and sleeping pill roulette. I would drink at night and take sleeping pills and hope that I wouldn't wake up in the morning. And the reason I was doing that is because in case there were spiritual rules on the other side, and if I on purpose killed myself, I was afraid of, maybe I'd be punished for eternity. Maybe there really is a hell after all. And so I did that for a long time. I ended up in what's our city's primary psychiatric hospital, which was Western Psych. Spent 2 weeks there. They let me out after 2 weeks. I don't know why. And I kind of sort of felt better. I should add that beginning at the age of 17, I started being prescribed psychiatric medication. It never worked for me. I guess it works for some people, but it doesn't work for a lot of people. Um, and I'd been on psych meds on and off since I was 17. And in 2007, in the psych hospital, they put me on more psych meds, which actually made it worse. So things just continued to go downhill. I told you earlier that I encountered the book Conversations with God. Who's it by? I forget.
Neil Donald
Yes.
Walsh.
And when I read it, because of my fundamentalist Christian upbringing, it scared the hell out of me because it's kind of contrary to those fundamentalist teachings. And it said things like, if God is who they say he is, why does he need us to worship him? He doesn't need anything from us. I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. But oh no, I better put up the cross to block from this satanic information. And I put that book aside because it scared me so much. And then I continued to be depressed. I continued to be is unfunctional a word? Dysfunctional. And I then encountered another book, The Four Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz, which was, I have to say, was the book that was the real beginning of my awakening. And I read that. I liked it, but I was still scared to examine something outside of fundamentalist Christianity, and things just kept getting worse and worse. Then in 2013, I had a plan to kill myself. I had become fully convinced at that point that life was purposeless, that my life had no meaning, and all this pain I was in, if there was no purpose or meaning, especially spiritually, if there was no truth to any of that, and I was in pain, what's the point of going on? I said, it's time to put myself out of my misery. I started researching suicide methods.
Okay, I'm going to interrupt right
Okay,
here.
good. What?
Because you were very specific in your book about how that came about and what you discovered was going to work that's illegal in this country.
Oh, okay. You want me to talk about that?
No.
Oh, okay.
I'm going to ask you not to say, give the specific details of what that was.
Yeah.
Because anyone listening to this broadcast, I'd rather they didn't have access to that information.
Yeah, I was a little conflicted about putting that in my book, and I totally get what you're saying. So anyway, when I was making this plan and I was writing letters to my children, I suddenly had a thought that I do believe now was somehow from Spirit that said to me, what if there's another way? What if there's something you haven't encountered yet about healing yourself? And I'd done everything to try to heal myself, except for ECT, which is electroconvulsive therapy, and nothing had worked. And suddenly I had that thought, what if there's something you haven't found? And so I stopped what I was doing. I went upstairs to my desktop at the time, and I started Googling alternative ways to heal depression. And it's amazing that that had never occurred to me before, but my brain was so fried, and I was so indoctrinated into the only thing that's going to fix you are drugs and talk therapy. And uh, on my screen, surprisingly enough, besides alternative holistic types of things about healing depression, was Gary Zhukov's book, The Dancing Woolly Masters, A Layperson's Guide to Quantum Physics. And I'm like, what is that doing here? It was one of those sidebar ads. And I became intrigued because the quote from the book was exploring the infinite possibilities within, etc. And I got the book. I rush ordered it. I started reading it. I couldn't put it down. It was all about how electrons work, and I'm not scientifically minded at all. So it explained how electrons, atoms, photons worked, how energy is connected to everything. And as I began to learn about that, about quantum physics, I began to realize that I'm not alone, that I'm actually connected to everything. And this was a process. And I began to not feel so alone. I began to think that there was something actually beyond, besides heaven and hell, and that maybe I didn't have to be terrified of death. And I immersed myself in quantum physics, and a series of interconnected things began to happen, including I found a guy. He calls himself an applied spiritual philosopher. I'll give him a plug. It's Steve Troy. And he's a therapist, too. And when I met with him, he knew all about quantum physics, and he knew about the connection between quantum physics and spirituality. And he began to talk to me on what they call nowadays deconstruction. He began to talk to me about the other major religions, about how physics and energy apply to who we are. And then he introduced me to neuroplasticity. And neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to rewire itself. And this is still spiritual because I don't use the word God. I typically say the divine creator or the intelligent orchestrator, but that intelligent orchestrator created my brain. And Donald Hebb in 1949 was the first to talk about that the brain is actually not hardwired, that we can change our brains. And we can change our brains by understanding energy, how the electrons, neurons, and photons work. And so I dove into that. I actually developed methods for how to rewire my brain. And in that process of learning about the brain, this was a big one. I discovered that I'm not my thoughts. I'm like, what? I'm not my thought? What? If I'm not my thoughts, who am I? And I learned more about that I'm the observer of my thoughts, that my soul, my spirit is who I am, that is what is observing my thoughts. When I learn more about thoughts, for instance, I could say, I'm a complete loser, everybody hates me, I'm worthless. Those are just thoughts that I don't have to believe. And so I changed my thoughts and therefore changed my neurochemistry. And over a period of about 8 months, my depression went away because I had discovered that I'm not alone in the universe, that I'm connected to everything, that something actually loves me. And I also learned that was transformative is that suffering is a good thing. That if you, all the bad things that had happened to me, and lots of bad things that happened to me, that I no longer looked at those things as why me, or why are these bad things happening to me? And I happen to love Viktor Frankl. He was a Holocaust survivor who wrote the book Man's Search for Meaning. Is when I began to see the bad things that had happened as divine lessons meant to teach me. And when I began to look at those lessons for what they were, and you can choose to suffer, or if you see it as a spiritual lesson, you can learn and grow from those things. And that becomes a choice. So instead of miring in the depression and these bad things that happened to me, I really began to see them as lessons. And now the truth of the matter is, of course, some bad things still happen in my life. I'm human. Sometimes I'm sad. Sometimes things don't work out. And I immediately look for the lesson. And I know it's divine. And from that, I literally wake up every morning joyful. It doesn't even matter what's going on, because joy is a spiritual thing. It comes from within. It isn't dependent on external circumstances. And a life that was once tragic is beautiful. I mean, everything in my life is just beautiful. That doesn't mean bad things don't happen, but the way that I see it is I'm so thankful. Literally, I wake up thankful. I'm thankful all the time for everything.
Yeah, you've taken that concept of things happening to you and turned it into things happen for you.
Yes.
Instead.
That's a great way to say it.
And that's such a freeing idea, that if you see that the universe is with you and it wants you to succeed and it wants you to be happy, then the sky's the limit.
They are gifts. Those things that happen are purely gifts. And Buddha talked a lot about, suffering is really, I can't quote him exactly, but suffering is only because of how your perception. So you can change your perception, and then you don't suffer. And the other thing is, now that I know this, sometimes people might be upset that I say this, but for me, now that I have the knowledge and the tools, to be depressed for me would be a choice. And there have been a couple times early in my recovery where I thought I was getting depressed, but I have the tools now, including nature, not only an understanding of the universe, of spirituality, that I'm a soul, that I can't be destroyed. And it's such a mystery. I used to really worry, like, okay, when I die, if I'm not going to hell, what's going to happen? And I was just thinking about this yesterday when I was thinking about meeting with you, is that it's a mystery, and it's a beautiful mystery. And I'm not even scared anymore. I think, hopefully I feel, a lot of people say, I hope I die in my sleep. I don't. I hope I'm conscious, and I know, because I'm like, this could be exciting. Like, what's next? So that's where I am.
Yeah, and there are some other writers, like Robert Monroe, who's founded the Monroe Institute, that deals with what happens next.
Yes.
And there are people who've had near-death experiences, who've gone beyond the veil and come back.
Yes.
So that they have also written books to say, okay, here's what happens next.
Yes.
And it takes away that mystery.
Well, speaking of the veil, part of my spiritual awakening was I had this moment that, it sounds crazy, but I actually had this experience where I could see past the veil. I could see that I'm not this personality, I'm not an ego, that I'm a spiritual being. And when that happened, especially then, that was a few years ago, I walk around like people don't know this. Like, this isn't really who we are. And sometimes I feel like I can't even relate to people who don't know that. It's amazing.
Yeah.
It's still mysterious because we don't know for sure.
Well, it's there are people who live constantly in the third dimension,
Yes.
which is just what you can experience with your senses.
See, touch, and feel.
And there's people who know that there's something beyond just that three-dimensional world, and they come from a different perspective and a different place. And somehow you have to learn to relate
Yes.
and understand that everybody's on their own journey.
Yes.
They take their own time to get to where we're all going. And the best way to, I think, the best way to help people is just to be who you are, to be the example. And you don't have to talk to them or try to convince them of some other way of being, but they experienced you differently. I'm sure that people you've known for a while say, who is this person?
Yeah. One of these people she's my friend who I've known her for like 35 years. She refers to me as a walking miracle because everybody experienced me as this morose, depressed person most of my life, and it's genuine. And you said something about just now about personality or something, is that initially I felt like I had to walk around the world like spiritual and all about love and all that. And then I discovered that it's okay to have a personality. Obviously I have one. And it's okay. You don't have to be all that, but you can let people see that you live joyfully. And people said, like, why are you always so happy? I'm like, because there's no reason not to be happy. But yeah, and also, what you just said about everybody's on their own path. Initially, I felt like I need to share this information with everybody, but you have to be ready. And the old, I think Buddha said it, when the student is ready, the teacher will appear,
Right.
which was what Steve was in my life. There's this one little paragraph. I just want to read this one little paragraph. Is that okay? From my book.
Sure.
So I already referred to how I was trying to find a person to fill my emptiness. And after I discovered that that's not possible, so here I wrote, after so many years of relationship highs and lows, thinking that the external world, circumstances, and people would bring me happiness, I was coming to understand that romantic love is only a hint from the intelligent creator, igniting a light that intends to draw us back to our original source. We are meant to fall in love with the universe, with our creator, or God, if you will, and all its splendor. What a revelation.
Yeah. Yeah, there's in the Course in Miracles, and I know that that's one book that you spent quite a bit of time with.
Yes.
Uh,
Oh, yes. I forgot about that.
As have I.
Yes.
In fact, my wife and I were in Rwanda for 7 months, and we read the Course in Miracles to each other. And that helped get us through because there was no television and no radio.
Wow.
So
I might go to Rwanda to do that.
Yeah, that gave us something to do. And that's a difficult book to get through on your own. There are study groups around all over the country that study the Course in Miracles together. But that's something that helped you get through all this.
Yes.
From what you said in your book.
Well, one of my favorite lines from A Course in Miracle is that the curriculum is mandatory. Sometimes I feel like I don't really want to do this. This is challenging to develop spiritually, but you can't get out of here without following the curriculum. And when someone first told me about reincarnation, like I thought it was Steve. I'm like, oh, he's a kook. He's crazy. I didn't accept that at all, and I'm not even going to go into that because it doesn't really matter. But the curriculum is mandatory. Until we complete the curriculum, we're probably going to be stuck here in our bodies. And the other thing is, the other really cool thing about awakening is to fully know that we are not our bodies. We are not, these are temporary things here on earth, learning a life lesson. And that's amazing.
Yeah. There's somebody who's pretty popular on YouTube, Father Sean O'Leary,
Haven't heard of him.
and he's all about what he calls spirits in spacesuits. That we are just our spirit. This is our spacesuit, and we are not our bodies, but this is what we travel in while we're here on Earth.
Yes. Yes. And that's so reassuring. I mean, at a very spiritual level, it's so reassuring to know we're not these bodies. They get old. I'm getting old. They get old and they decay and then you die. And that's depressing.
Yeah.
So to know that there's definitely something beyond. And I think the third law of thermodynamics says energy is indestructible. You can't destroy energy. So obviously we're comprised of energy, electrons, neurons, photons, all that. We've got something like 7 trillion atoms in our bodies, and that's energy. You can't destroy it. So somehow we go on.
Yeah, we're eternal.
Yes, I'm just hoping that I get to see my husband on the other side. This one thing is like, I wonder, are we going to really see people? Are we are we going to be conscious? That's the one thing I still wonder about.
Well, that's all we are is consciousness.
Yes, the observer.
So that lives on.
Yes.
So a couple things. In your book, you mention as a young child that you had an experience that sometimes got you through other situations because somehow that experience told you there was more to this life than what you knew at the moment.
Yes.
So could you describe that a little bit?
I'm certain that was a spiritual experience. So I was probably 5 or so, and I'd been in the foster home for about a year at that point, and as I said earlier, she wasn't nice to us, and I was lying in bed crying one night, and I still am not certain if it came as a dream, it was a vision, or what happened, but I just felt completely lost and alone. And in the air, the space sort of above me, appeared a girl who looked like me. And I said, at first I was startled. She was sort of like floating there, and she had a radiant light around her head. And I said, "Who are you?" And she said, "I'm you. I'm both parts of you. And this isn't everything." And I'm trying to recall exactly now. This isn't everything, and things will get better. And that comforted me for many, many years. And it came back to me as I was awakening, several years ago, that, and the two parts are you're a soul and you're a physical body. And that helped me not be afraid. I didn't know what it meant then, but it helped me. It was comforting. It helped me not be afraid.
Yeah. So the non-Disneyland experience.
Yeah, I don't. It was like terribly, like people reading like that's the most sad thing I ever heard. Now it's just like ancient history.
Yeah. But it came to my mind. Well, I wonder once she became more spiritual and got rid of her depression, did she make the effort to go to Disneyland to just kind of clear the air on that one?
Well, I didn't go because of that, but I had since been to Disneyland.
Okay.
And I think people have said, "Why would your mother do that?" And I think my mother was afraid. She was afraid to tell us what she was doing, and I would imagine she felt guilty about it, and she couldn't face us.
Mhm.
And for a long time, I didn't forgive her for that. And that's the other component of being spiritual is eventually I forgave both of my parents because, well, for one thing, I made a heck of a lot of mistakes with my children, and that brings me to another thing, is that part of a spiritual awakening is you have to forgive yourself. And forgiving yourself and forgiving others doesn't at all discount what happened, but it releases you from the energy of unforgiveness. And you got to forgive because it has to free up space for you to grow spiritually. But yeah, she was, I mean, she had a terrible childhood. She was terribly abused by alcoholic parents. She wasn't loved. She got married at 16 to get away from them. And so, yeah, I've been to Disneyland a few times since then.
Okay.
Not in the past couple decades, but previously.
Yeah.
I tried to convince my children to let me take them to Disneyland, and they didn't want to go. So I never got to take them.
Well, given if they knew of your experience.
They didn't at that time.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. No,
Because
they
I
just,
certainly wouldn't want you to say to me as your child, I'm taking you to Disneyland.
I've never even told them that to date. And this is funny. Both of them say, I'm never going to read your book. I'm like, okay, you don't have to, but it might help you understand what happened. But I think eventually their curiosity will get the better of them. But no, I've never told them that.
Yeah. Well, maybe you can get them to listen to this podcast.
I know. Well, I've offered to have them listen to my other podcast, but I don't know. It's really funny. It's like when Jesus went back to Nazareth, and he was Jesus, and the people in his community said, "Who is this Jesus? He's a son of a carpenter. He's nobody special." And I kind of feel like that's the case with my children. Is they can't possibly comprehend fully my spiritual awakening. They can see I'm a different person, but I think they're just very unimpressed by what I'm doing. I tell my son, I said, my book won a national award. It was best. He's like, okay. So I'm way more impressed with myself than they're impressed with me.
Well, humility is overrated, right?
I don't know. But the thing is, I am very humble about this, even though, one of the things I learned about the ego is as long as you know the ego is ego and the ego is a tool, and I'm humbled by that in itself, is that it's okay to enjoy your life.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's
Oh,
okay.
It's imperative, I think.
Yes, yeah, and I totally enjoy my life. Part of the spiritual awakening had to do with nature, though, also. I just want to put that in there. In my book, I explained the various things I did to heal myself, and nature is really important. Even if you aren't near a naturey place, I mean, you can just go out for a walk in your neighborhood because nature has energy and healing energy. And when I left the third marriage, which was a bad marriage, I went and lived in the mountains for 2 years. I had the luxury of living in the mountains, and I hiked every day in the mountains, in the woods, in the forests, and sometimes, as goofy as it may seem, I never hugged a tree, but I would take off my shoes because there's studies that show that there's an electromagnetic core to the earth. I would take off my shoes and walk in the meadows, and I am telling you, nature was very essential part of my healing spiritually.
So, I guess when I think about what I've read in your book and what makes me curious, and I can tell you that not having been a depressed person, although I was in an orphanage for 2 years.
Oh, were you?
So I identified with your 2 years in the foster home. And there's a sense that you get when it comes to family that there isn't that family isn't that important because if someone can give you away, even when they bring you back,
Mm-hmm.
you think, okay, what does that mean to me in
Yes.
terms of family values, or there's something else. And to my thought with that is that family is much broader and bigger.
Mm-hmm.
Just as Jesus said, who is your neighbor?
Mm-hmm.
And I recently interviewed a Muslim who said, well, Muslims believe that your neighbor isn't just the person who lives next to you, it's the person who lives 4 blocks from you, and it's a 4 block radius.
And it's a community.
And those are all your neighbors. So you take care of each other
Uh-huh.
within that larger, what I would call family. Uh,
Yeah, Western society has gotten community wrong,
yeah,
because of the how my children had to experience me when I was depressed. Um, I love my children, and they love me, sort of. And I adore my grandchildren. But my family is the community that I've built because I don't. My father and brother are my only two relatives, besides my children, and they live in California. And I've seen them a few times in the past 40 years. So I've created my own family. I have friends who love me and I love, and who were committed to each other. And it's a wonderful thing because just because you give birth to somebody or they gave birth to you doesn't necessarily mean they're part of your community.
right, right.
And that's so fulfilling. That's the biggest thing I learned. I used to be so isolated, such a loner, to realize how important connectedness, and like the little excerpt I read, it's that connectedness, I believe, is the creator drawing us to, I don't want to say him by any means, to them. So yes, I built my own little family.
Yeah, that's terrific. Well, at this point in every podcast, I give the interviewee the opportunity to leave a few words of wisdom with the
Ooh.
audience.
Hmm.
Uh, I know that at the end of your book, you kind of summarize what you feel are the important components of your spiritual life. You just mentioned one of them, that nature was a critical part of that.
Hmm.
Uh, so I don't want to lead you.
Are you
in-
talking about the various elements that I
right?
described? Okay.
Yes.
Um, yeah, well, for one thing, spiritual study and spiritual awareness and nature and community. And when you told me you were going to ask me that, the thing that popped to my mind is to, as you're studying, as you're healing, as you're exploring your spiritual nature and using brain wiring techniques and nature and nutrition and health. Are these the things you're referring to?
Yes.
Okay. And so I don't, sometimes I get a little lazy, but those components, all of them, I stay on top of. Every day I have to do something in nature, even when it's 6 degrees, I figure it out. Um, I have to exercise. Now I've gained a little weight since COVID. I'm totally blaming it on COVID, but I'm gonna get back. Um, uh, Careful about your nutrition, what you put in your body, exposing yourself on purpose to joyful things like dancing, music. Um, and as far as wisdom, I would say to anybody who's exploring their spiritual condition or nature or trying to grow is absolutely you have to have compassion for yourself. And one of the things I learned about that is years ago, I ran into a man who I knew who'd spent several years in prison because he was robbing people at gunpoint. And I met him really randomly. And this man had completely transformed his life. And I thought to myself, and I forgave him. And I thought, if I can't forgive myself, I can't forgive others. You have to create the space of compassion, knowing that you did the best you could with what you knew at the time, what you were capable of. And just having compassion for yourself and being patient with yourself, which also allows you to have compassion and be patient with others, and to just let things unfold. Does that answer your question?
That does.
Okay.
I think that's a perfect way to wrap up for
Okay,
today.
all right.
Thank you so much,
Thank you
Deborah.
so much.
And on my website, we will have some additional information. So some of the books that we referenced today, information about those will be on the website. Your information will also be on my website, so people can contact you if they wish.
All right.
Deborah is also a life coach. Remember that? So that's good for all of us. Thank you so much.
All right.
Until next time, do your homework, audience. Think about what was important that resonated with you from today's discussion, and take some time to sit with it. Until next time.